Good evening. You're listening to Christian Media Trust on Southeast Radio. My name is Jarlath Glynn, and this programme is brought to you by Wexford County Council Library Service. 2020 marks the centenary of the War of Independence. During the month of March, this programme will examine the War of Independence in County Wexford. Tonight we will get an overview of what happened in the county, and in later programmes we will examine the events in more detail. I'm joined now by Barry Lacey. Barry is an archaeologist and he has a keen interest in local history, especially the War of Independence. Barry, you're very welcome to the programme.
Thanks very much, Jarlath.
Now, before we look at what happened in our own county, can you fill us in on what led to the war nationally?
Yeah. Well, I suppose when you look at focusing on the County Wexford, it has a long history of resistance and various different rebellions, the Fenian Rising, but probably one of the most prominent that's etched into the memory of people in the county is 1798. And then this inspired further uprisings such as 1916, when Enniscorthy was one of the only places outside of Dublin to rise up in armed rebellion. And it was also the last to surrender as well at that point. So much and so that they wouldn't actually take the orders from the British military or believe that they had surrendered in Dublin. But this, after following on from the aftermath in 1916, a lot of people were interned in Furlong in Wales. And during this time, they plotted and they planned and they knew that there was going to be a second time. Even when they met the surrender up in Dublin, two of the volunteers had to be escorted to the jail, and they were told in secret to hide the weapons, we'll need them again. So they knew very well that this was going to be the last round of hostilities. And when they came back, they reorganised and they came together. And they formed various different companies throughout the country. And then Sinn Féin stood in the 1918 elections, and this was in the background to conscription, which was the mandatory joining of the British military during World War I, a war which a lot of Irish people felt that had nothing to do with them. That was England's war and not Ireland's war. And they had a resounding result in the elections. They won 75 out of 105 seats. And then they decided to ignore the British Parliament and go and do their own thing. And they held the first Dáil on the 21st of January in the Mansion House in Dublin, 1919. And on the same day, we had the first ambush during the War of Independence. This is in Sullihead Beg, when Dan Breen and several other people ambushed two local RIC men escorting a consignment of gelignite to the quarry. So the two of those events are considered the start of the war.
And what were the breakout of hostilities in Wexford? What happened?
Well, Wexford was kind of slow to start off in the hostilities. The first, actually, interesting question, because the first attempt at ambush in Wexford was in a place called Dunanore, on the Dungeon Road near Enniscorthy, and this happened in 1918, prior to the event in Sullihead Beg, and they attempted to ambush or an RIC patrol that was coming from Galbally to Enniscorthy, and just luckily for them, they decided to take a different route on the day. But if that had happened, it probably would have been one of the first ambushes, possibly in the country, preceding Dan Breen's Sullihead Beg ambush. But the first probably successful ambush, which a shot was fired, took place in 1920 in a place near Ballycarney called Munfin, when they opened fire on several police who were in a patrol car. But no parties were injured. But if you read the reports from the time, it's interesting because they conflict each other. The report in the paper says that the police got away because of their gallantry and their good aiming, and that they were attacked by upwards of maybe 40 or 50 people, where if you read the witness accounts from the time, there was only several men involved in it, no more than 10. And they said that RIC said that they wounded several people. Well, really, there was no casualties on either side.
So which should we believe? The people that joined, the young volunteers, and they generally were young volunteers, who else joined?
Well, like I said, most of it was young men, and I suppose we see that predominantly because we think of the physical aspects, the IRA, out in all weathers, with the trench coats and the rifles and the caps. But everyone took part in all ages. We had the Fianna Éireann, that was kind of the Boy Scouts of the wing of the IRA, and they would have done a lot of maybe scouting or passing through messages. We had Cumann, which was the women's branch. A lot of the local women were responsible. These men were running a war, and they had to be fed, watered, and their wounds healed, and these women did all that work, and some of them even got a bit more involved as well, carrying messages and weapons where needed. And also a lot of men who might not have been up to the task of the physical aspect got involved in ways that they could. There's reference to a munitions factory where the IRA tried to make their own ammunition. They made a lot of buckshot from the lead pellets, and it says specifically that a lot of the elderly men used to do that, because obviously they weren't able to do the physical aspect anymore, but yet they got involved in whatever way they could.
It was guerrilla warfare, but how did they actually organise themselves in groups?
So Wexford was part of the 3rd Eastern Division of the IRA. This took in all of Carlow and the entire county of Wexford. And then furthermore, Wexford was broken down into the North and South Brigade. And this was roughly, if you were to draw a line from near St. Mullins and New Ross, heading east down towards just below Islegate. And it takes a small bit of a dip there towards South Wexford into Powell Pasty. And the North Wexford Brigade took in the northern part of this county, up as far as near Baltinglass and parts of South Wicklow, and then the other area south was the South Wexford Brigade. And then each brigade was made up of 4 battalions, and then each battalion had various different companies. So these are the smallest of units within the division.
And how many people would have been involved, roughly how many people would have been involved altogether?
Well, to give you an idea, the North Wexford Brigade in July 1921, the archives record that there was about 1,236 members involved. And I don't have the exact number, but I remember from memory the South Wexford Brigade was something similar, probably around the 900 mark. So you're looking upwards of nearly 2,000 people involved. And that's not taking into account Cumann and the Fianna either.
That's a lot of volunteers.
A lot of volunteers.
You mentioned earlier about conscription, and there was a huge, gathering of opinion and objection to conscription, including the Catholic Church. What was their role? Did they oppose the IRA violence?
Yes, in 1921 there was several parishes denounced the violence by the IRA. These were in the parishes of Kilrush, Enniscorthy, Davidstown, Owlert, Crossabeg and Timon. But we also have examples of priests who would have definitely supported the IRA. There was a Father Darcy. One of the witness statements said that he was aware of an ambush that the RIC were going to have on the IRA when they were trying to do a counter ambush on the barracks. One was going to try to get the other when they didn't realise about it. And he had knowledge of it, and he alerted the local brigade, the local company commander, and he saved the lives of a lot of men that night.
The number of fatalities was quite small. It was 23 altogether in the county. That was much smaller than other counties like Cork and Dublin and Kerry, where there was much kind of disruption and mayhem. But in Wexford, there were a lot of attacks on our barracks and the railways. There were a lot, weren't there?
That's right. A lot of the time, people tend to measure the success of the various different parts of the IRA throughout the county by the casualties. Or I suppose the casualties numbers get the most news, like in Kilmichael and Cork, for example. But success shouldn't be measured on the number of injured parties, but rather Wexford, for example, like you're saying, although it had few injured parties or casualties in total, there was a lot of disruption to the British, and that kind of goes against the grain, I suppose, of what most historians would say, in that I think Wexford was very active despite the low measure of casualties. Like you were saying, a lot in 1920, August of that year, they got an order from the general headquarters in Dublin to burn any barracks that they could down in the county. And if you look at the number of barracks that were in the county prior to that and afterwards, it's a huge drastic drop. Barracks were burned in Kilmore, Oilgate, Ballinaboola, Tintern, Ballywilliam, Killan, Ballybrazil, Ballycanoe, Arthurstown, that's just a few to give you an example. And a lot of these especially were the rural barracks. Because what happened is when the IRA intensified their activities on these buildings, they concentrated first on the rural barracks. And this drove the RIC into the towns where they were safer in numbers to get out the Black and Tans and their auxiliaries. And a lot of the times, the buildings were burnt down on the day that they left, so that they couldn't be reoccupied and reused. So again, you have a classic example of they're making short work of the British resources and making it hard for them to function in the county at the time.
Are there any ruins of those barracks? Is there any, physical example in the landscape of those barracks?
There is now. Some of them are completely gone. Clonroach and Ferns, for example, in the one in Clonroach, the present guard station stands on it. But there are, especially as an archaeologist, is a very interesting point. There is a few physical remainders, like you're saying, because that's what I'm interested in. A lot of the time, the material remains of the period. And Ballybrazil is a very good example. The gutted remains of the building are there.
Now, you had an interesting story you were telling me before we came on air about Ballybrazil.
Oh, was that with the Sergeant Flynn? Mm-hmm. That's right, yeah. The interesting about Ballybrazil was that when they went to burn it on the night, Sergeant Flynn had vacated a building at that time, but his family were still vacant in there. And the IRA were actually very kind to the family, and they helped take away any furniture or belongings that they had inside, as well as a couple of chickens that they had out the back of it. And they brought him to a local house that would have been safe, and they carried out the torching of the building. And there was also a sergeant that was in there before Flynn. His name is after escaping me now, but he was originally from the Midlands, and he went back there on holidays. And he experienced an unfortunate event where one of his friends, long life friends, was actually shot by a member of the Black and Tans, and he left the force after that in protest.
Heard a lot of controversy about the RIC in recent times and the commemoration that was planned. Who were the RIC? What was their background? And I think in some areas, from what you said there, they were quite an integral part of the community. They
were, just like you're saying, there's a lot of controversy, and people are very, very quick to judge them during the period from War of Independence. But you have to remember that they existed a long time before that. They were the ordinary police force that kept the peace from the early part of the 19th century in Ireland. They were first called Irish Constabulary, and then they were known as the Royal Irish Constabulary. But they just did every day-to-day things, kept the peace, made sure everyone was safe. And as well as that, they were made up of majority of Irish men, both Catholic and Protestant. And when it came to the War of Independence, I suppose a lot of them were taken aback by surprise, where they were left with two choices. They had a family to fend for, but a lot of them wanted to support the cause as well. So we're stuck on the fence. And there was a lot of people left the RIC at the time of the War of Independence. I know there was an example in Listowel called the Listowel Mutiny, where a British sergeant remarked about the violence and how it should be on a lot of this population, and himself and several of the officers disagreed and left.
We will take a short musical break now. This piece of music is from Misha Era, composed by Sean O'Riordan. any conflict, such as the War of Independence, the gathering of intelligence is very important. What do they collect and how do they do it?
Well, like you're saying, any war, the people in the IRA needed to know the strength of their enemy, where they were going to be, because I suppose they learned from 1916 and of course heavily in 1798. A lot of the reasons they failed was because of informers. So they had a tight network, and they learned from their mistakes this time. And a lot of the ways they used to get intelligence was through the mails. Of course, nowadays we have emails, everything is safe. Well, it's supposed to be safe, I suppose. But back then, they raided a lot of the mail trains and a lot of the mail cars. And what they used to do is they used to open them up just randomly, and they used to stamp them censored by the IRA. And this was to give the idea to people, ordinary people just like yourself and me, that they were checking the mails regularly, and it would, I suppose, reduce the idea that people were going to go to the RIC and report them. And it gave the idea that they were a lot more of a good intelligence gathering unit than they may have seemed. And there's actually one story that says they received a letter from one of the Black and Tans when they opened it, just pure coincidental, and it said that there is any amount of chicken eggs that they could ship back to England if they only had a box to put them in. I'm sure where were they getting the chicken eggs from raiding the local farms at the time.
Moving on from that, how did the volunteers get their supplies of ammunition?
They made a lot of the ammunition. Now, in 1916 there was a lot of shipment of arms into the country, and like I said earlier, a lot of them were told to put them away, we'll need them another time. So some of the weapons were previously from 1916. A lot of people had their own weapons, shotguns. They used to manufacture buckshot, which was where they would melt the pellets into a single bullet, which gave it better range and accuracy. A lot of weapons were retrieved from ambushes and raids. Not so in Wexford, but they would have shared weapons throughout the country between different units. Like I know, for example, the Ferns Company gave weapons to the crowd up in Wicklow when they were attacking the Baltinglass station. So it was a mix of their own weapons, stuff they would have manufactured themselves, stuff they would have obtained from raids and ambushes, and also in the earlier parts of the days when before hostilities started to kick off a little bit more, a lot of British soldiers would become home on leave and they would be sympathetic to the cause, and they might leave a rifle maybe standing in the corner of a dance hall or something like that, and they would disappear and come back in and the window would be open and the rifle would be mysteriously gone.
There was a big raid on the Hook Lighthouse, wasn't there? They got a lot of ammunition, I think, there.
That they got a lot of, I think it was explosives that they used to use somehow for the sounding of the foghorn.
That's right.
So they got it wherever they could, and they got a lot of ammunition from quarries as well. I know there's one example in Bunclody where the foreman of the quarry was actually a volunteer as well, and he advised some of his local friends when there was going to be a consignment of gelignite explosives arriving to the quarry, and of course they took the opportunity and they took them away with them.
The biggest loss of life among the volunteers was the explosion in Salt Mills. That was very significant, I think, in the whole war in Wexford.
Yeah, it was in two reasons. Like you're saying, it was one of the biggest single loss of life, and also was a big downer to morale. Because we had the loss of Seamus Rafter, who was a 1916 veteran and who would have been looked up to by a lot of the volunteers at the time. And the loss of so many people and the loss of him left a bit of a void for a small while in the IRA, which a lot of historians say was the reason why Wexford wasn't so active. But we had assignments of different people from different areas then to the county, and that started to get activity back up again. But it was essentially a munitions factory. And the story goes is that they were preparing explosives and a person stood up and it was under candlelight and it knocked one of the candles and it set off some gunpowder and subsequent explosions, and unfortunately the 6 men were killed then. And
there were a lot of serious injuries, I think, among the other people there. The Black and Tans and the auxiliaries arrived in 1920. How active were they in the county?
They weren't as active as you might think when it comes to hearing about Cork and Tipperary. I suppose because we don't hear much about the ambushes in Wexford. But saying that, if you read any of the witness statements, they were going on regular patrols. They were constantly on the move, raiding houses. and they were very prominent in any of the local barracks. I remember reading about ambushes where they said there could be 10 or 20 black and tans in it at any time. And I'm sure if you were to refer to any people maybe who are listening tonight, they will have stories of the local black and tans. But they arrived in early 1920, and they were made up of mostly men who had fought in the First World War, maybe were unemployed, but just ordinary people who were looking for work as well. And then the auxiliaries arrived in 1921, and they were made up of army officers, and they were supposed to be a bit more disciplined in their order, and they both had the idea, both were brought in for the purpose of reinforcing the RIC, or the Royal Irish Constabulary at the time.
Obviously, there were a lot of safe houses for the volunteers. Now, this must have been very dangerous for the occupants of those houses.
It was very dangerous. You often read of how it's very interesting, because when you think about it and put yourself in that place of one of those houses at the time, the flying column could arrive in the middle of the night. You would have to give them their food, their bed, and if there was a raid or anything on the house, the column could escape over the hedge or the walls in very good safety, whereas the women had to stay in the house at the time, and I suppose face whatever it was that was coming with them. But these safe houses were dotted all over the county and the country, and they provided safe havens to the IRA, especially the flying columns, or the active service units as they were referred to, because they needed somewhere to heal their wounds and to sleep for the night, and to shelter.
What was the role of Cumann na Mán in this area?
Cumann na Mán was the women's branch of the IRA, and they were, again, heavily involved in the war. They would have actually trained themselves, and a lot of the time they would have provided intelligence as well, because a lot of the women maybe would have worked for the military, and while they were doing copies of various documents, they could have passed others on to the IRA as well. So the importance of the women can't be understated.
Definitely. In recent times, a lot of new information has become available about the War of Independence through the archives of the Bureau of Military History. Can you tell us what's in that archive?
There's an endless amount of information.
Well, sure, in a short.
I know. In short, I suppose one of the main things people might be interested in is the pension records. So in around the 1940s and 1950s, the government set up pensions for people who were involved in the War of Independence, and they took names, lists of activities and so on, and people can go online and search this by place, by first name, by surname, and by date of birth and death, and it's very accessible and very easy to readily available online. Another bit of information is the Bureau of Military History. This were witness statements taken by survivors from the period, which give very detailed accounts of the activities at the time, and they weren't biased in who they interviewed. They interviewed RIC officers, former RIC officers, IRA, Cumann na Mán, and you can go online and you can just do it by a word search. So if you're from a local area, say Ballycarney, where I'm from, I'd enter Ballycarney, and every listing for that I would get. So another thing is the brigade activity files, which was done up to help support the pensions, giving lists and details of people and the activities they were involved in. And they're very good if you want to look up what was going on in your local area or with the local company.
So, if you have a relative involved in the War of Independence, it's relatively easy to find information online. Is everything online?
No, they are bringing out new things as they come along. If you were to go and look online, in the last 5 years, there's been the world of information that has been uploaded. But I know not everyone is tech savvy, and there is other resources. There has been a book brought out by the UCC press there recently called The Atlas of the Irish Revolution. It's a huge book, and it covers everything from the period from 1916 up until the Civil War, and it's definitely worth a read. And of course there's local publications as well. There's one by a Seamus MacNeill covering the Civil War at the time, and Nicky Furlong has a book with Hayes out on the revolution in Wexford. So I encourage people to visit your local library and have a look.
And of course then there are the newspapers.
That's right, the newspapers accounts. And I should have remembered those. They're very easily accessible online, and they're great because a lot of the time they're not biased towards the events. They just give the basic facts and the details, and that's what you want when you're trying to make an informed decision on what took place. And
what paper would you think would be the best to consult?
I would recommend the Free Press. I I think it's a very good newspaper. So they have some images, but they give a lot of detail about the events that took place. And also the local Lena's County Guardian is good as well.
Thank you.
I just want to say thanks very much for having me here this evening, Jarlath, to yourself and the Library Service. And just to make people aware that I am doing a project called The Wexford's War of Independence, documenting and recording from 1919 to 1921. And if anyone would like to hear any more of the information of what I talked tonight, it's available on Facebook and on Twitter.
That brings the programme to a conclusion. Thank you, Barry, for being my guest this evening, and to Patricia on sound. Next Monday, I will be speaking to a granddaughter of one of the men who survived the explosion in Salt Mills, and to another historian who has researched the Lacey family, who were very much involved in the revolutionary period.
This program was produced by the Christian Media Trust, exclusively for South East Radio.
South East Radio.